In this video, we will describe preparing the drive gear. For the axle, we're using a shaft off a 1/2-inch bolt. Now, I have found that a 1/2-inch bolt works better than a piece of hot-rolled rod, because a hot-rolled rod is really inconsistent. And we're using this as an axle. It's going to fit into a plastic bearing. We wanted a nice, consistent, round rod to use, and I found a 1/2-inch bolt was really the best thing to do, and it's exactly a 1/2 inch. We'll need to weld the sprocket 1 inch and 1/8 from the end, so we've made a mark here at 1 inch and 1/8. And because we'll be welding to this, this is a plated bolt. We took the grinder and we just ground through the plating. You don't need to grind very deep, and we don't want to change the shape of it, so we don't want to grind it out of round. Just enough to get the plating off of there. If you use a raw steel bolt, you don't need to do that. But again, this one's zinc plated, so we had to just a little bit of grinding there to get the zinc plating off the area where we're going to weld, which is at 1 inch and 1/8 from the end. Now, it's very important that we get our sprocket square and straight on there. So we've got to be able to clamp it down some way while we weld it so it doesn't distort or warp. And I found an easy trick to show you. We took a piece of wood and we very carefully, we did this in a drill press, we drilled a 1/2-inch hole square and straight through the wood. Now I'm going to be able to take my axle and stick it in that hole. And so that axle is coming out of the wood, and it's square both here and side to side and front to back. And that's very important because we're going to use this surface here to line up the gear square side to side, front to back. So we're going to put the bolt down in that hole up to our 1 inch and 1/8 mark. Leave that mark stick out just a little bit because the gear is going to go right where it covers up that mark. It'll put the center of that gear right at 1 inch and 1/8 from the end. And then as we slide the gear over the axle, and again, let me just double check, make sure we see our mark there. Slide the gear over the axle. Now the axle and the gear are very straight and plumb to each other. And then we're just going to really lightly clamp that gear down to the wood. And just lightly, don't need to overdo it. That ensures that the gear is square to the axle, and in this view, both front to back and side to side, and we can check that with a square just to make sure. Now we're going to weld this, and the way we're going to weld it is we're going to do 2 half moons. We don't necessarily need to weld all the way around it. We don't want to over weld because we don't want to warp this gear. But what we're going to do is we're going to take and we're going to put a weld on the front side here, halfway around, and maybe it'll meet the other weld, but that's not important. And then we're going to put another weld around the back side, halfway around. Once those welds are done, we know the gear is straight and 90 degrees to the axle. Then we can take the axle out of our little fixture here and we'll put a weld on the other side also. And so that should help you get the drive gear straight and square on the axle. If it's not, it'll wobble, and you'll see that right away.